Hiya, today I'm going to show you how to sharpen a a plane blade, a carpenter's plane. This one here is a jack plane. It's a really useful plane, the most common one that we use. I've never bought anything bigger. I've had this one about 30 years. I'm a fully qualified carpenter with sitting guilds. If that makes any difference, you're either good at it or you're not. I happen to be okay. This one here I've had, as I say, for probably about 30 years. It's a really good plane. It's made by Bailey, but it has a Stanley lever plates on it, or should I say lever cap. I'm not really quite sure, just goes to show that really once they designed the plane they couldn't really improve upon it. I don't think it's changed for a very, very long time. I don't think it'll ever change, to be honest with you. That is, unless you buy an electric one. This one here has several parts. On this one it has a wooden handle. It is quite an old one. As you can see, it's broken, but I've not really taken any notice of that. For the last 30 years I've just used it. I've just got used to using it. So the parts of a plane, you've got the lever cap, you've got underneath that, you've got the cap iron, that's attached to the blade. Down here you have the cutter nut, that adjusts the height of the blade, and then here you have the lever tilt. It moves from side to side, and as you can see, that affects the angle at which the blade comes through the bottom of the plane. The bottom of the plane, this is the sole, and the bit where the blade comes out is called the mouth. I only learned these parts the other day, just simply because I've never really needed to use them or know them. So I learned them just purely for this video, which, there we are, you learn something new every day. How to take this apart is quite simple. The lever cap, you simply lift this part up here, oops, and that just slides out. As you can see, when it goes back in, it just simply locks down onto that. Push that down, and that's it in place. You shouldn't need much pressure on this. It's stiff enough to hold it in place, but not so stiff that you need a crowbar to get it off or anything leverage like designed like that. You should simply be able to put a few pounds of pressure on that and push it back into place quite simply. It's held in place with this screw here. The height adjustment of that screw, even though it's got a attachment on it, you don't really need a screwdriver. You can do that up with your fingers once this is out. So you take that out simply like that, and then that screw is exposed, and you can just finger tighten it in and out depending on how much you need it. Put the lever cap back in, push the thing down. If it's too loose, you know you've got it too loose. If it is too loose, it'll allow this here to move around more than it needs to. If it's in too tight, then you'll have trouble with the cutter nut putting it up and down in the plane, should I say adjusting it. Right, taking this out. This now is the cap iron and the blade. They're attached together, and that's what the plane looks like without them. Just put that down. As you can see, this lever tilt moves that bar, and that sits in this groove here, and that basically tilts that. So that's it, plane. On here you have the cap iron and the blade attached to each other just simply by the friction of this screw. As you can see, the cap iron sits slightly below the plane blade. As you can see on this plane blade, I've slightly curved it. I've always, when I've sharpened it, curved it up, shaped it like that, simply because it's just easier for me to get a nice clean cut as it shaves off the wood. Some people like them dead square. I personally, over the years, have just learned to curve it, really. As you can see, the cap iron is perfectly square, so you can see really how much that is adjusted to my liking. On the other side, the blade, that angle there, on many books you'll come across something that will say put two angles on it. I don't put two angles on it. I simply, when I sharpen it, take off from the back what I'm going to take off from the front, and that means that I don't need a grinder to take that off at any point. if you do get people that try to put two edges on, I found, they tend to need a grinder to take the initial edge off, and then you put your sharpening edge on, which is at a slightly different angle. The trouble is that they don't seem to keep it at the same angle. They tend to, over time, slowly do that because they just don't want to sharpen it on the stone too long, and what that ends up doing is that creates an edge like that in the end where you can't even get an edge on it. It won't plane anything, it's just rubbish. So that's why I just put one edge on it. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Taking this off is pretty simple. What you do is you grab your lever cap, and on here is an edge that should be thin enough to fit in that screw there, and then you just undo it a little bit more. You don't take it off, and then you take the blade out. I highly recommend turning it before you take it out. You don't want this steel butting against that steel, otherwise it'll wreck your edge even more, and you don't really want to do that. You want to save time. What I will say is that on the old planes you can fit this groove edge in this groove, but somebody I know the other day bought a cheaper plane, and for some reason this edge was too thick to fit in there, so you had to get a screwdriver to undo that. Whoever designed it didn't design it properly. They didn't ask any carpenter, and they certainly hadn't got hold of an old plane by the looks of it and tested it. So if they did, then I don't know why they didn't take any notice. In the end though, I had to go to the toolbox and get a screwdriver just to undo this, when normally you don't have to travel anywhere. I'm just lazy. Right, so that's your blade. As you can see, that's how it looks, flat side, chamfered side. And now I shall show you in a second how to sharpen that. Next thing though, just as important as your plane, try and not buy a cheap plane, because the cheap ones are just rubbish. They have rubbish steel, you can't sharpen them properly, they fall apart, they're just rubbish. Don't buy it. Oilstone. This one here is an oilstone box that I made out of an old piece of wood. Inside it sits the oilstone. The oilstone is just as important as the tools that you use. So even though it just looks like an oilstone, don't for 1 second think that this is you can buy a cheap one and it'll do a job just as good as an expensive one, or should I say one that's reasonably priced. This one here is an India IB8. I think they're also called a Norton India IB8. That's Norton, India like the country, and I for India, B for Bravo, but just the letter B, and 8, the number 8. So it's a Norton India IB8. It has two sides to it. There's the red side, which is the fine side, and then you have a dark grey side, which is the rough side. That's a coarse side. If you've taken a big chip out your chisel or your plane, then you can grind it down on this. I've never really used it, to be honest with you, but every now and then you do hit a nail. You do end up having to take an awful lot of the steel off, so that's really what this is for. But mostly you'll just use the fine side. That's the only side you're ever going to need. Oh, one more thing on here, try and keep the stone nice and level that way and nice and level that way when you're sharpening things. People tend to just use the center of the stone, and all that does is it scallops it, scoops it out, and then your stone ends up deformed. It's really hard to use after that on certain things, especially wide blades, to get them nice and sharpened on a level surface. They also tend to use just the middle of the stone, so they scoop, so they tend to use just the middle bit, and then they tend to use just that bit there, which deforms the stone in two ways. It scalps it that way and it scalps it that way, and what you end up with is something akin to this. I don't know if you can see that. Alright, it's been used by somebody, to be honest with you, not too bad. I bought it second hand years ago after somebody stole my original India IB8 stone, so I bought this as a temporary. It was good enough, it did the job until I managed to afford this one. These are about £20. Try and buy it from a reputable dealer. There's no point in buying it from a cheap place. The cheap oil stones, about £10 I think the cheap ones are, but as soon as you try and sharpen something, they literally just turn to dust. It's like a fine grain on the top. You're just moving that around. It's just so inaccurate. You will hate it. If you buy a more expensive one from a reputable dealer, I wouldn't try and buy anything off the internet unless you know it's a reputable shop. So if you do that, you risk buying a forgery. That's how important they are. People do understand that forgeries can be sold because people are looking for good stones. But as I say, a good stone is just as important as the tools that you buy to sharpen them on. Right, a second, I'll show you how to sharpen this blade.